Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we have a jam-packed day here. And, we're going to be talking a little bit about the transfer portal. And also in a couple subsequent videos, we'll also be doing a breakdown of the Texas Longhorns and the Duke Blue Devils. We're going to do a season review on that. But with us today is Les from Less is More Sports. He primarily focuses on college football and college basketball. Highly recommend you check him out on Twitter. But Les, it's great to have you on, and if you can just give the audience a little Reader's Digest of what you do, that'd be greatly appreciated. And once again, I appreciate being generous with your time and coming on today.
First things first, Rob, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. But for anyone that's interested in the Less is More Sports podcast, what we focus on is we talk more about the offseason of college football and college basketball, because me and my two hosts are such fans of the team building process of college sports. But yeah, that's basically what we cover on the Less is More Sports podcast. We do a little bit. I myself am personally a college basketball recruiting fanatic. I have been since I was a young kid, and I absolutely love college football as well. I also follow college football recruiting very heavily. So that is the recruiting aspect is really what I focus on primarily on my show. But with everything going on in the transfer portal, Rob, I think we both can agree there's just so much to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that with everybody. And I'm going to put your credentials for Twitter, the link to your YouTube podcast, all of that in the description. I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted you on here, was because I think on both of our podcasts, we definitely like to shed light on the transfer portal and talk about recruiting and kind of, those deeper dives, as opposed to kind of just the typical, ESPN Reader's Digest of the games. But, you look at the transfer portal here and, there's such a big percentage of kids coming in, right? And they got rid of the spring transfer portal, which I think is really a great thing, right? Because you have only have one shot to get everybody, but also it's a little bit overwhelming for, some of the coaches whose seasons end a little bit in the latter part of the year. And, with all this movement going on, there's just been so many kind of moves to break down. And even half the time, you don't even know whether it actually is a move because, they could decommit or they didn't technically sign or whatever loophole you want to throw in there. But Les, with that said, I mean, the portal's been open for roughly a little over a week now. And, as you kind of dive into this, what are a couple, you have a couple names that you kind of keep your eye on in terms of a guy who can really be a true difference maker, and maybe a couple guys that are a little bit under the radar that you think the audience here would appreciate? And I know that's such a loaded question, but I wanted to keep it open-ended for you.
No, I think it's a perfect question to ask. And one of the first names that comes to mind when I think about who's some underrated players in the transfer portal is the safety Ty Beningfield, who just transferred to LSU from Boise State. You look at his career and body of work with the Broncos, and he had a very successful career with them, had over 100 tackles this year, very complete, well-rounded safety. And I look at him and what he did at Boise State, and it's clear that he just wanted to go to a bigger market team so that he could have exposure and maybe improve his draft stock a little bit. And to go to a team like LSU that is stereotypically known for being one of the DBUs of college football, I think it's good for branding. And not to mention, under the new regime of Lane Kiffin has a reputation of having great offensive teams. But to really change the narrative of being able to add defense on that side of the ball, guys like Beningfield are kind of the cornerstone to really change that narrative. So when I look at Ty Beningfield, that's one name that I think is really going under the radar that I think more people should be talking about. But another name that I want to talk about is a guy that we really haven't seen anything from. Lincoln Kienholz going to Louisville. I think that's a very underrated quarterback move. He sat for 3 years at Ohio State behind Kyle McCord, Will Howard, Julian Sayin, and he's a former 4-star recruit with a lot of talent. And there's a lot of intrigue going on about what this kid has, what he's got. We got to see it this year. But most of all, here in Louisville, there's been a running joke about Jeff Brom having a type when it comes to recruiting quarterbacks from the transfer portal. And the funny thing is that Kienholz does not fit that mold at all. Maybe he's adding a little bit of variety to his type. I know Miller Moss, among a lot of other things, was criticized for his toughness amongst Louisville fans, but Card Nation won't have those feelings about Kienholz. From what I've seen from his recruiting tape, he's the type who will lower his shoulder and run over a defender on 3rd and short to get a crucial first down. But the thing is where I really find an intrigue with this move is that you pair Kienholz's dual threat abilities with the fact that Louisville was able to outbid Texas for Isaac Brown, and they were able to bring him back. Kawan Brown is still on the roster, and they bring in Marquise Davis from Missouri. And now all of a sudden, Jeff Brom has an interesting direction with where he can go with his offense. So potentially having the best rushing attack in the ACC. So that's why I think Kienholz is another one I think is really going under the radar here.
And for those of you listening, we don't know what you're gonna say, right? But I was gonna mention Kienholz regardless anyway, because the first thought to myself was, you know what, they got Miller Moss last year, and coming into that situation, I think a lot of people had some higher expectations, but also Louisville also had some freshman kids that you argue that you could have probably gave them a chance to. So for them to get a guy like that who has been able to sit behind that Ohio State, quarterbacks for a number of years now, I definitely think that's a really big deal. So I'm glad you mentioned that too. And, another guy that I'll kind of mention that I think could be, really fascinating to kind of watch is, I'm really curious to see where Cam Coleman's going to go, who, transferred from Auburn. He is taking a couple visits now. The first school I heard was Texas Tech. I've also heard Texas, but, he's one of those dudes where the upside is absolutely incredible. He's one of the most talented receivers in the entire country, just highlight reel after highlight reel after all the time. And he's going to be one of those dudes. And he's only a sophomore too. So I think whoever ends up getting this kid is going to be, a legitimate number one guy coming off the break too. Because I even think of schools like an Oklahoma would love to have a kid like him, or even Texas, or really any school in the country. But those are a couple of schools that kind of come to mind when I think of a guy like Cam Coleman.
No, it's hard not to mention a guy like Cam Coleman. Kid has all the talent in the world. Like you said, has just a knack for making that spectacular catch. I mean, he would make any quarterback, just have a joy to play with.
Yeah, absolutely too. And I also heard about Eric Singleton too, who's taking a visit to Florida. So I'm definitely Auburn has had I think 27 guys transfer out since Alex Goulash has left. So I'm kind of curious to kind of see how this team is kind of evolves, right? Because even last year there was a lot of hype going into this Auburn team. I was definitely a little bit more on the Jackson Arnold train than I would like to admit, but in hindsight, I think they were trying to find that catch 22 of, hey, we know this guy can be the guy to ultimately run the offense and everything, but you also know that he does have a ceiling as a passer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess another team I'll throw out there too is I really love what Northwestern is doing. Between you have Chip Kelly, they also brought in Aiden Childs, who I get when people look at the box score about Childs out of Michigan State. I think some people will be a little cautious, especially since he got benched in the latter half of the season. But if you kind of watch some of those beginning games and you really kind of dig a little deeper, he has some really raw athleticism that simply isn't coachable. He has pretty solid mechanics, all things considered. And when he actually does have legitimate protection around him, I've seen a couple of examples of him being really poised and being able to make, especially those intermediate throws that ultimately ends up being the difference between, kind of converting those second and third downs. He's definitely a guy that I'm really intrigued about. And especially, with Northwestern getting Ryan Field going, and you're in the Big Ten, which is that conference is open as ever now too. I'm definitely excited to see where that school goes as well.
Oh, absolutely. And when they hired Chip Kelly, that move just sent shot. I mean, that move alone just, for any college football fan knows that, it's going to be a move of intrigue. I mean, his last college football coaching job, he was the offensive coordinator at Ohio State. They won a national championship and, just has a reputation of building some of the best offenses in college football. And the thing with Aiden Childs is that he's always been a talented recruit. But the problem is he's been with teams that maybe you could argue is like he didn't really have the best supporting cast around him. I look at like what Michigan State and their offense overall, their problems went way beyond him. I mean, so I think he got a lot of unfair criticism for his performances at Michigan State. But no, he's a talented recruit. He goes to a school with an offensive-minded coach like a Chip Kelly, and Northwestern, they have the 29th rated portal class right now, which is very impressive for where you would expect to see a school like Northwestern, and with already 11 commits. So it's interesting to see what they're going to be able to build, and if this is going to be the right fit for Aiden Childs to be able to show the talented prospect that I saw coming up through the recruiting ranks.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you're able to elaborate on that too, because I know it. I know at least for some of our casual fans, it's kind of easy to look at the box score and say, "Oh, he's thrown 10 or 12 interceptions." Bench him or whatever. Because I guess the one thing that kind of fascinates me about the transfer portal, and I definitely want you to elaborate on this too, is just how much, just the lack of patience overall when it comes to actually developing quarterbacks in particular now too. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we're just seeing so many more quarterbacks kind of transferring year after year. So if you just want to kind of elaborate a little bit more on kind of your take overall on how quarterbacks have kind of developed within the past 5 years, and also maybe a couple underrated names or some bigger names that you think are just going to be a really good fit for where they're at right now.
Yeah, so I think I have this running joke going on my show that a lot of things, as this is more of a social construct that I talk about on my show, is how we, in this generation, we just want things now. I mean, I think the internet era has just wanted quick results. So I think teams have kind of bought into that narrative, and it's like, if we don't get results now, we kind of got to look for the next guy. And I think it's really put a hindering on development of quarterbacks. Sometimes the reality is that quarterbacks aren't going to be able to step in year one and be able to deliver right away. I know Arch Manning at Texas, for one, he's come in, sat for a couple years behind Quinn Ewers, and then he came in this year, became the starter, and he had his bumps and bruises, but then even we watched him develop as the year goes on. So I think it's more of a social construct and just how we want things right now that is ruining the overall developmental process of these quarterbacks, not just in college football, but really even at every level of football.
Yeah, because I even ask myself too. I try to find a balance, right? Because at the end of the day, I do love the traditions of college football. I think it's beneficial overall to the players overall that they're able to sit for a year or two and kind of learn the fundamentals. But also, you kind of sit there and realize that hey, when there's other schools that will use you as your starter immediately, I totally understand. Like even Overstreet, the kid from USC, I'm a big fan of him, and I kind of asked myself, man, if he would sit for another year, I can probably almost guarantee that he'd probably start next year for him, and you're pretty much going to be the starter the next 2 years there. But I also understand that for anybody who's watched his high school tape, he could go ahead and easily start at a school like Nebraska. Like, I think he'd be a phenomenal fit in Nebraska with Matt Rule over there. I think he has a lot of similar skill sets to Raiola as well, which, by the way, we haven't heard much about where he's going, and that could be
he's kind of gone under the radar, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because I kind of asked myself too, and particularly with quarterbacks, it's tough because I think the big change that I'm seeing right now is everybody, just like you said, everybody wants the quick fix. But I think you're kind of seeing it translate into the NFL level now too, where, not only are they not getting developed as much, but also there's these expectations of, oh, you have to walk into the NFL and be immediately ready too. So and I think you're kind of seeing that linger within, especially the decisions for the transfer portal and whatnot too. And another guy I'll ask you about more specifically too is Kenny Minchie, who originally committed to Nebraska, and now he's going to go with Will Stein over to Kentucky. And I get he's got to do what he's got to do, but I just wanted to get your general take on what your overall thoughts on Minchie were, because I think he's a really intriguing kid to watch.
No, he's definitely a talented prospect, and he's going to an offensive-minded coach with Will Stein, who, ironically enough, I want to say, first of all, that as being a St. X grad, I absolutely hate the idea that both Jeff Brom and Will Stein are Trinity graduates. So just the whole thing about that rivalry, U of L, UK dynamic running through the Shamrocks, is one that does not necessarily sit well with my St. X heart. But no, I think it's another thing that's worth noting is how impressive it's been for Will Stein to be able to make all these offseason moves while still calling plays for Oregon, obviously up until last night. But for them, Kentucky's quietly making moves to, transition into the Will Stein era. And, Kenny Minchie, he is a very talented prospect. And now it's a similar theme with Chip Kelly and Aiden Childs, is that these are offensive minded coaches that are gearing up with these talented quarterbacks that necessarily haven't gotten a shot. So it's definitely going to be an intrigue to watch. But I mean, I think he's actually a pretty good fit. I mean, I look at, a quarterback like what Dante Moore did with Oregon this year. And I'm not going to say that he's maybe as talented as Dante Moore. Maybe it will be as good as Dante Moore. I hope that people don't get that twisted, but he can do a lot of similar things that Dante Moore can do. And I think it's going to be an interesting fit to see what he does at Kentucky this year.
And I'm glad you prefaced that, because at first I kind of had a quizzical look when you mentioned that. But then once I kind of remembered Dante Moore in his earlier days at UCLA, and I think he kind of maybe perhaps hit kind of a wall there, realizing like, hey, this isn't as good of a fit as it could be. I think Kenny Minchie's kind of in that same space, knowing like, hey, CJ Carr had a great freshman year. He's clearly going to be their guy moving forward. I can probably still go to a school that has a lot of parallels to Notre Dame. I think that's why at first Nebraska would have been a really good fit for him, because, as a blue blood, the school kind of sells itself too, but also you have a up and coming school like Kentucky, who has a lot of hype and a lot of excitement too. And I also kind of wonder in the back of my mind, what would happen if Kentucky still had Vince Morrow. I think that would be real. I think just that battle within the state of Kentucky in particular is going to be something to kind of keep your eyes on too.
When Vince Morrow was brought in from Kentucky, I think a lot of the local fan base knew that the narrative was going to shift, and how it was going to be interesting to see how many Kentucky players, when they enter the portal or even as recruits, were going to shift to Louisville. And now we're seeing that this year is that 4 players from Kentucky have now transferred to Louisville. So the Vince Morrow thing, I think us here locally understood what was going to come with that, and now we're seeing it in real time. But another quarterback that I do want to talk about that I'm really interested to see is because he also sat for a couple years behind some pretty big names, and that's Trey Owens at Texas. He sat behind Quinn Ewers. He sat behind Arch Manning. He was a 3-star recruit coming out of Texas, had a very decorated Texas high school football career. Some of the only action that we saw from him is, Texas's spring game, but he goes out, he's slinging it. I mean, kid's got an arm. He can throw with accuracy. I really like what this kid brings to the table. And I think it's going to be interesting to see him play for a team like Arkansas State and see what he brings to the table, because kid's got a lot of talent. Kid's got a big arm. I'm just happy to see him get a chance to show that off.
And especially too, Arkansas State has had Jalen Rayner as their quarterback for a couple seasons now. And when I found that out, I immediately thought to myself, there are so many parallels between both those kids, right? Because, Arkansas State has been under the radar for a couple years now, but you can pretty much book at least a bowl game out of those guys, right? Yeah. And give a shout out to Butch Jones, be able to revitalize his career at Arkansas State after kind of the shit show he had at Tennessee. But nevertheless, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for a guy like Owens. You play in a wide open Sun Belt division. You essentially, have a path realistically to get to a bowl game every year. And, it's only to get better over in Jonesboro.
I do have a question about the transfer portal before we move, maybe transition, but is it just me, or as we complete the first week of the transfer portal and all the moves that are happening, is it fair to say that a lot of what's happened so far, as much as what's happened, that it's surprising, there's a lot that's happened that's very predictable as well. I think one of the big narratives heading into this transfer portal is with all these crazy coaching moves that we've seen, like James Franklin getting fired from Penn State and going to Virginia Tech, with Matt Campbell coming in to replace James Franklin at Penn State, with North Texas coach going to Oklahoma State. Yeah. Lane Kiffin going to LSU. One of the popular narratives is that a big chunk of these players were just going to follow their coaches from their previous destination to their current destination. And as we look at the current transfer portal rankings right now, Penn State is number 1 with 29 commits, because they're basically becoming Iowa State 2.0 right now as far as roster look. LSU is number 2 with 18 commits. Not as many Ole Miss guys are following Lane Kiffin as maybe Matt Campbell from Iowa State, but still, we knew a new regime would bring in a lot of movement, a lot of transfer portal additions. And Oklahoma State, 39 commits right now. And they're basically becoming North Texas, Cowboys right now. And which brings me to another thing is like, I'm very interested to see how Drew Mestamaker and Caleb Hawkins adapt to playing in a power conference, because those were two very good players, at a smaller conference, North Texas, and to see them transition into a power, conference, I'm intrigued to watch that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Oklahoma State too, because I was gonna mention them, and we kind of got sidetracked, but yeah, I have a buddy who covered Oklahoma State, CJ Tour on YouTube. Definitely check him out. But that was one of the things that we talked about, was kind of how this Oklahoma State team was going to look. And last year they revamped their entire coaching staff. They got a bunch of freshmen and sophomores, and they hired Ty Granaham. You know how that turned out. And then they got Doug Meacham and whatnot too. And we saw what happened over with Oklahoma when Ben Arbuckle and John Mateer came over, and they had relatively moderate success, but they're going to be able to run it back for his senior year. If they can get a legitimate number one guy there, that could be a lot of fun. But I'm glad you brought that up. I'm a little hesitant to kind of just say, oh, just because it worked at North Texas, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to work at Oklahoma State too, because even when you think about all the schools that you have to recruit against for those top schools in Texas. I mean, I think about the Baylors of the world, the TCUs of the world, the SMUs of the world. And I think just the idea that you're just gonna be able to plant a bunch of guys in North Texas and all of a sudden you're to get to a bowl game. I think that definitely sounds easier said than done.
And sorry if you did, but did you mention Texas Tech as well? Because they're throwing a lot of money out there too.
Yeah, well, that's the trouble, right? Is when you think about Texas Tech, I know the cynical way to think about it is, well, they spend $30 million to get their ass beat by Oregon in the playoff. I know that obviously is a grossly oversimplification, but at the same time too, the Big 12, I think, is one of the greatest things about that conference in general, is how unpredictable it is. And should they be favored every year? Yeah, probably at this point they should be favored every year. When you got a guy like James Blanchard who turned down Notre Dame, you have a guy like Joey McGuire who's really kind of clicking schematically and getting those right guys in there. But now that they do have a legitimate number one quarterback in Sorsby, it could be a legitimate game difference maker for him.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, I'll ask you one more thing too. If you were the commissioner of college football, what would your rules be in terms of the transfer portal?
The best idea I've heard is that one free transfer, and then you have to sit out a year unless there's a coaching change. Because I think I understand the legality of the whole thing. I mean, if coaches can move at will, players should be able to move at will. And I agree with that. But there also comes a point where it's like, you can't run from the grind either. I mean, we see sometimes that some of the best players that have played at every level of football got to the point that they got because they had to earn their starting job. And then I was listening to AJ McCarron talk on Johnny Manziel's podcast, and I thought he made as good a point at this as ever, is that he knew that he could not mess up at Alabama and start playing bad because he had a fear of the bench. And I think with the transfer portal now, with how easily accessible it is, and even though I love it, and I think it should be a thing, there also isn't a fear of the bench right now, because some of those back end guys, if they're not playing initially at Alabama, they can just go transfer to a school, maybe even like a Texas Tech, or, I'm just throwing names out there, but there's no fear of the bench anymore. And I think there is something to be said for, waiting your turn and developing properly. But I also, that was a good question. That actually is a good question, because I'm trying to gain my thoughts here. There's so much to say to that. But overall, I think, so for time constraints, that the best thing I've heard is one free transfer and then to sit out a year unless there is a coaching change.